Thank you and welcome to Manchester Art Galleries and to Objects of Obsessions, where we look at how artists use the work of others as a touchstone, a source of inspiration. And tonight we're joined by an artist who has been at the forefront of boundary breaking in British art for the last 30 years, if not more, who's moved from painting to installation to collaboration to, on occasion, provocation, who at the age of 23 back in 1985 was the first black woman artist in the Tate's collection and only the fifth woman. Since then, she's gone on to many great things, including being given an MBE in 2007, joining the illustrious Royal Academy of Arts in 2016, although I would say that, wouldn't I? And also showing at the Venice Biennale in 2015. She is, of course, Sonia Boyce. Sonia, welcome.
Hi.
Your object of obsession is this extraordinary painting by James Northcote, also a Royal Academician, made in 1826. Who is it, or what is it, and what obsesses you about it or appeals to you about it?
Well, it's a portrait of Ira Aldridge, who was an African-American actor who came to the UK. So that's who it's a portrait of, though he's particularly known for being kind of Shakespearean actor, and I suppose that's the thing that I was really interested in, is his role as not only within theatre, but particularly as his relationship with Shakespeare and the British theatre.
So he was American. Do we know what he was doing in Britain?
I'm not quite sure why he came to Britain. I mean, it's not. In a way, I know bits about his life, and I'm not quite sure. I got the impression that he wasn't getting much work in the US, and that may be one of the reasons why he came to the UK. But it's not. I've not really studied him as a figure. More, I've been interested in this painting, which I seem to have known for about 20 or 30 years. It seems to. I was the other day trying to remember when the first time I saw it, and there's something just so lush for me about this particular painting.
Apparently it was the first, or certainly one of the first, I think the first painting of the Manchester Art Gallery collection. At least that's one of the narratives I've read. What interests me, I want to pick up on your lushness, but its original title, or at least the title it once had, is there, which just says Amour.
Yeah.
A black person or someone from North Africa. But obviously, then we find out that it's an actor playing Othello, Amour, and then it's Ira Aldridge, we know who it is. So is this a portrait of a man, or is this a portrait of a man in performing a role, acting out? I mean, is it that layering that appeals to you, or is it his singular humanity that first attracts you?
I think the thing that first attracted me was the nature of the portrait, but subsequently, and particularly in the last few years, what's drawn me to this is him as Ira, as Amour, as an Othello character, always this kind of as something else, always there's something deferred, and I suppose that's one of the things that I've really been thinking a lot about in relation to this work, is that you see something in a way you don't see something, that there's always something deferred or something masked by something else, whether it's him playing Othello or whether it's, I mean, apparently he often in terms of his own biography, would say that he'd come from Africa rather than come from America. So, you know, him as his own within his own biography was always playing something else about his own biography. So
creating myths, creating roles, I suppose.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That is interesting. And he's also described as the African Roscius, as in the great classical or Roman actor who also was a slave before he became an actor, which may have narrative connections or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that particularly his standing within British theatre, biographically, I think is something that many people are only, well, particularly in the UK, are really taking up now, as in terms of the scholarship around his actual career. And of course, that being referenced to what was happening in America in terms of acting and the title that he had there and how that shifted when he came in. But he had a very hard time here in the UK. There was a lot of jealousy about the kind of notices that he was attracting from, particularly when he was working in East London, So there was a lot of competition amongst other actors about him kind of occupying a very special place within theatre.
Taking their roles in inverted
Yes.
commas, because he whited up to play other great Shakespearean roles. He wasn't just typecast as Othello.
Well, apparently, and you know, we'll probably talk about this a bit when we talk about some of the recent things I've been done here. That I wasn't really aware that much of whiteface minstrelsy, but apparently it was very common to have whiteface minstrelsy as well as blackface minstrelsy. So it may not have been an oddity at that moment for him to take up that question of literally masking himself in a particular way.
Do you think this painting, as painted by an establishment figure, Northcutt, does it, I wouldn't say make him less safe, but does it diminish his power, or does it save him for posterity, or is it a mixture of the two?
Oh, it's probably a mixture of the two. I mean, I don't know necessarily that within the scholarship of theatre in the UK that he's taken up that greatly. So there's still a great way, you know, there's still a distance to go in terms of however much he may have been part of or be seen as part of the establishment. There's still a hidden history there, which I think is really important. I always seem to draw towards institutional structures myself. You know, you kind of mention all of these. My partner always says that I'm kind of collecting titles. So I'm often, you know, kind of drawn to these power structures, and I think that. So I don't know that one would say of Ira Aldridge that his capacity and his abilities were lessened by being part of the establishment, and I don't think he had an easy time with the establishment, even if he was greatly aligned with it.
Let's just talk about painting for a moment, because obviously, I mean, I'm not going to project the idea that you feel part of a lineage that goes back to Northcutt, although in a sense being at the Royal Academy you are, but painting, when you became prominent in the 1980s, was this, I mean, I know there had been a return, in inverted commas, which is a ludicrous description really, but there'd been the notion of a return to painting in the mainstream, but it was still a very contested art form, as it is now, although I would say less so. What was it about painting for you in the 80s that drew you to it? I mean, were you aware of its art political overtones from the beginning?
Absolutely. I was fortunate enough to be very involved in a lot of feminist art debates that were happening right at the end of the 70s and into the 80s, where painting was absolutely the kind of troublesome ground to be working in. And there were a lot of quite fierce battles about, you know, the position of painting, its hierarchy within the other forms of art practice, visual arts practice. And at the same time, there was also a huge debate about whether one should use the female form or not. You know, some people align themselves with what could be called a kind of Mary Kelly position within feminist art discourses, or there was another camp, you could say, that was very much about the performative body and claiming the body within visual arts. And so I was kind of very much part of those, seeing those battles being played out, and painting was almost the worst thing you could be doing if you're going to be representing the body at that point. And we're talking very, very early, or end of the 70s, early 80s. But for me at that point, I also felt very strongly that there were so few examples of what I would call rich images of the black female body that I felt that I couldn't evacuate that space. And so I was driven towards making imaging. And actually it was figures like Frida Kahlo, which of course everybody now knows, who kind of cemented my interest in operating within painting and figure.
So there's a sort of both a reclamation of the notion of the female body, but also yourself, that you often positioned your own face and body, or at least evocations of that in your art, and that was important too, was it?
That was important. I mean, I have to say, I had a lot of trouble with it after a certain point, But really, I was in the figure because I didn't have to pay myself. You know, it was a very pragmatic choice, actually. And I suppose when I was studying in the West Midlands, in a very small town called Stourbridge. There were not many black people living in Stourbridge. So my choices of who I could have as a model, and I had trained from the age of 15 life drawing. So I'd had a fairly academic beginning in art. So for me, drawing from the body was something that I had been trained in. And so I used myself because it was just easier to do that, to tell the kinds of stories that I was interested in.
And what were those, I mean, when I say what were those stories, there's a multiplicity of them, but a lot of them seem to relate both to your own personal upbringing, but to a kind of black British or Afro-Caribbean experience. That's fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But, you know, one of the things, and one of the questions that brings me very closely my relationship to this painting and things that I've done subsequently was this question about how one represents identity, but in a very performative way. So these are not kind of candid images that, you know, of observing somebody who doesn't know that you're observing them. They're very much, those works were very much about performing towards an audience somehow, being very self-aware of being looked at in some way.
So actually in things like missionary position or lay back and think of what makes Britain great, you're subject and object, and you're acting out.
Acting out, most definitely. And that, for me, that's what kind of, I think drew me towards this particular work, was that to know that he's an actor, that to know that also his biography, that these things kind of collapse in some way in this particular portrait, but that he is performing for us. Even though he's looking askance, there is an address to us, but him as a professional actor.
Yeah, I like the looking off into the distance, which makes him, I don't think it's a contrived charisma, but it makes him elusive.
Yeah.
Although there's a real sense of physical presence here. And walking through these great galleries here in Manchester, I mean, I was looking at the only black faces you see or figures you see are attendants or servants. I mean, there's a Stubbs painting of animal, of, you know, a cheetah and a lion, and the attendants exist there. And so, in a sense, this is a rarity, isn't it? I mean, I suppose seeing this for the first time, it must have struck you as an exception rather than anything atypical of British art at the time.
One of the things that in kind of trying to think about doing this event, was trying to recall when was the first time that I saw this painting. And I'm not quite sure whether I saw it first in reproduction. There was a great series that was of publications that came out from the mid-1980s about the black in Western art, a really beautiful series of books, and it may have been there that I first saw the image of this painting. Or I may have seen it in a show that was at Tate Britain in the mid-1990s, which was about the black subject within British art. And I can't quite remember, because both were kind of a similar time, and also I'm getting old and my memory's going. But I've been struggling to figure out when was the first time I actually saw this and was struck by this work. But it's somewhere around the late 1980s and into the 90s. And I really loved I have to say something about the shirt.
Please do.
In that, one of the things that really captures me, and also what could be a necklace or something, is that it immediately felt quite dandyish to me, and this is what keeps pulling me back to this work. Is this something slightly coquettish about the painting, about the image, about the way in which she wears this garment, that I kind of starts to kind of, what's the word, suggest that there possibly are other readings one could make of him painted like this.
Which you do in a most recent work where a performance artist sort of assumes the personality, and there's an extraordinary sort of masquerade, which I want to come on to in a minute. But I want to just look at the shift or the expansion of your practice. I mean, first of all, I don't know if I'm being too reductive, but before you went into sculpture and installation, and this collaboration with audiences that you've become quite rightly celebrated for. There was collage. Was it that systematic? When you made a piece like, from Tarzan to Rambo at the end of the 80s, was that you exploring some of the limitations of painting and it was part of the journey into sculpture, or had you already thought about working in installation and sculpture?
I think what happened, or the thing that I suppose I remember, is I was making a work called She Ain't Holding Them Up, She's Holding On, some English Rose, where I've got this, I'm holding up this family image, and it's very directly related to a Frida Kahlo painting, but that's an aside. And in the midst of doing this particular work, I realised that I couldn't work in this way anymore. I literally had come to a full stop. And so what I started to do in terms of my move towards collage was I started to use all of the elements that made up those kind of painted works were actually collaged, but were collaged in one medium. So I would get a wallpaper from one source, and then I'd take images from my mother's living room and bring those things together, and I was constantly bringing all these different elements in order to create those images.
So they're intellectual collages from your imagination.
Yeah, but they're from real things. They're from real either designs, and as I'm sure you know, I was particularly interested in William Morris, and so I was using. Actually, I'll go back a little bit more. In when I was doing life, I started off by doing life drawing when I was about 15. And I was always told by Arthur, who was the life drawing tutor, son, you've got to put the background in. I was only ever interested in drawing the figure and nothing else. So there wouldn't be, and he said, well, actually, in terms of being able to contextualise where this figure is and the proportion, to make sure that the proportions are right, you have to actually include the background. And it was through realising that I wasn't really that interested in the background that I happened upon a book on patterns. I thought, what if I put the pattern behind? Then I don't have to worry about trying to measure everything else up. And it was through that, and of course it was William Morris design that I first used, that I started to realise, actually, there's something about flattening space. We could talk about Gauguin, we could talk about a whole range of other painters, that actually it can fill a flat pattern can fill a space in a particular way that I don't have to worry about whether the proportions are right or whether the perspective's right. It's all very flat and very on the surface. I can just fill things in, and in a way it's collage.
Yeah, and you talk about it very articulately in formal terms, but of course there are literal and metaphorical layers there. So Morris's political interests and agendas, the fact that some of the wallpaper was made as commemoration for the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the empire, or part of the colonial history, and the fact it comes from memory of your own upbringing, people have interpreted that in terms of the exotic or the domestic. So all these aspects you're conscious and subconscious of, not fully controlling of when you use them.
Yeah, but I mean also in terms of the question about collage itself has a political history, and that's where I was particularly interested in what was happening in the early 20s, early 30s around collage, and whether one's there's a whole range of people that one can kind of refer to. That collage itself, even though I suppose we kind of think about collage now as being much more childlike than its origins as a kind of political force.
Well, Dada, and particularly in Germany, that photo montage of people like Hartfeld and others, it was absolutely radical. But there's a formal disjuncture that collage brings into play. You can say it's both harmonising, but in the main, there's a disjuncture of elements that seems to apply to the way that you collaborate and use individuals and contexts and situations. Yeah,
and I, in a way, I'm still doing the same thing. It's just I've moved the medium a bit. So if one thinks about moving image or about sound, the question of the edit and the cut is the same as collage. It's the same as the drawings that I was and paintings that I was doing from the early, from those early works. That actually I've always been editing and cutting and collapsing a number of things together that for some people may be a bit too much, but I'm always collapsing these thematics as well as these formal things.
And does that have a political undertow for you?
Always. I mean, we could talk about the fact that I have been working more and more with groups of people, often very, very improvised ways, and then what I'm interested in when whatever takes place is that I capture those things and then I work with that as material. I work with people as material, though that sounds quite awful in some ways. But I'm really interested in the kind of negotiation of social spaces, which of course is a subject that was in those early works, because I was trying to talk about growing up in the UK and in those. Well, I was really talking about my childhood and my parents' generation coming and those experiences of growing up in this context that was a disjuncture actually.
I was thinking about a relatively early piece that you made, well, towards the end of the 90s, 1997, with people. And it was made here in Manchester called The Audition, where, I mean, the finished piece involves, I think, 500 people, each photographed wearing an afro wig and not. Mm-hmm. And you did that with Manchester University and the old corner house here. So the finished work is a grid of images. Mm-hmm. Was it conceptually a grid? Was it rigorous from the start, or did that have slightly more amorphous beginnings or origins?
What to say about that project? Well, what I will say is that I was surprised by the number of people who wanted to be involved.
Did you tell them what they would actually be doing?
So people knew that, you know, the notice that went out was, you know, come and be photographed wearing an afro, you know, we'll provide an afro wig. Yeah. So they knew that was going to happen. They knew that I was going to be photographing them. I was expecting about maybe 10 people might come for the day, and it was just a complete day of photographing like so many people. So that was quite a surprise, even though I did actually have lots of film with me, thankfully. But it's only, I suppose, when processing the aftermath of it and thinking about photography is sequential. So you already have a grid within the frame of whether it's cinema or whether it's photography at that point, because I was working with negatives at that point. So the grid is already intrinsic to the medium.
But you didn't know when you made the invitation exactly how the work was going to be completed. It was a journey of discovery through how many people turned up and what your own response to, or how you dealt with the material you gathered.
Yeah, I was going to say that I suppose what has shifted very slowly for me, and it actually was around that time, and Manchester has been very important in terms of the shift in my practice, was that I had I'd kind of set out a kind of formal proposition, and then something happens that kind of shifts what I'd intended, and so I then have to adapt to the shift that's occurred. So I suppose I went into thinking about the audition is that there would be about 10 people who would come, and then I would choose, because the nature of an audition is that you would choose the
protagonist,
the protagonist, that would, and so I was going to make a poster of the chosen person who I would think works an afro really well.
And so what did you bottle that choice, or did you actually realise that having that many people made a different kind of work?
It became a different kind of work. And it's really taken me quite a long time to actually figure out the shifting from this idea of the singular image to actually there's something else has unfolded over time through doing that project. And that there are images within there that are so-called good photographs, and then there are lots of bad photographs. But actually what's most interesting is to see all of the photographs, which kind of goes counter to how photography is often thought about as whether it's a decisive moment or not.
Yes.
That actually, you see it across the 36 frames that might be in one film, that something has occurred across that timeline.
I mean, they're all decisive, but some are more decisive
than others.
Others indeed. Yes. Also, the notion of black and white and the other, one and other, and that sort of triggers in my mind various film pieces you made. Two in particular, one from 2007 called You Only You, and a later piece that you made in 2015 called Exquisite Cacophony, where you set up two different kinds of sound or approach to sound or music, and there's a sense of confrontation.
Always.
Was that from the beginning of those pieces you wanted to set up something? I mean, You Only You involved Almere, the great early music group from Cambridge College, Sydney, Sussex. But then you had an experimental sound artist. How did you persuade each to engage with the other?
Actually, at the beginning of that project, we didn't all know why we were in the same room together. You know, because of that difference. You know, what can we say to each other? And my original idea, which I abandoned pretty quickly, was that I wanted to have this kind of choir clash, but actually didn't want to. In hearing Almere sing, I didn't want to do that to their sound, which was very beautiful, very delicate, very fragile. Yet there was something in what I'd heard Mikhail in another context.
Mikhail Kariakis, yeah.
Kariakis, yes, in a completely other context, and just thought, it's kind of gut. It's basically working with one's gut and thinking, oh, there's something really interesting. It's completely different, but there's something that feels like they could somehow be in the same room together. I don't know what until it actually happens, until it actually unfolds. But I do often work with these opposites somehow and try and find the space where they can somehow coexist, even if the coexistence is troubled.
And how were they together?
It was quite difficult at first. And I think what was interesting for me and troubling maybe for both Mikhail and for Almere. What happened was that Mikhail was offered this score by Josquin Desprez, very familiar to Almere. They sing this particular piece all the time, and he chopped it up and rearranged it. So he gave them back something that they were familiar with in a way that was they'd never encountered before. But within that, he introduced not only his own form of singing, which is very guttural and comes from a kind of early modernist, Dadaist kind of tradition of sound and noise, which kind of in itself, when you hear that, you know there's going to be some sorts of tensions between them. But the thing that I found most fascinating about what Mikhail did was that he introduced a 13 beats to the bar within this 4 beats to the bar composition that they knew. So he was basically asking the Almere to be in this space of double consciousness, which is a space that, there are many people who have, particularly in terms of African American scholars, who've talked about the existence of the situation of living through a form of double consciousness. So he was basically asking them to do that with the way in which he kind of introduced this other rhythm into that piece. But he was also brought into that piece the use of jazz scat. That was what he was being influenced by performers like Ella Fitzgerald and those kind of non-linguistic sounds, which of course both Dada and jazz have been very interested in. Now on the other side, of course, Almere were having to say to Mikhail, this is who we are. And so it was a very interesting and awkward dance between these imagined different styles or different approaches that somehow in the piece finds a resolution. For me, it finds a resolution.
I agree, actually, having heard it, but I thought as it began that disorder tends to be able to trump order in that situation because it's more energetic, it's noisier, and the disruption is the thing that you notice. But then slowly there's a kind of harmonious disharmony, if that, I mean, it is a paradox, but so you obviously found some kind of resolution in the finished artwork. It led to, I would suggest, exquisite cacophony, among other things. So you then bring 2 other, Astronautilus and Elaine Missioner, and you're looking again at 2 different kind of sound traditions. But how did the 2 protagonists in You Only You, how did they feel afterwards? Was an element of feeling manipulated, or did they genuinely feel they'd learnt from each other and from you? Or can you not be concerned with that?
I'm not sure that that's what it was about. I suppose Alamire were puzzled at the end of it as to what does this mean and was this worth doing? It's like, I think they just came out of it kind of a bit stunned and not really knowing what it was. So in a way I don't think they could quite manage the edges of it. I think for Mikhail, he came out of it thinking about how one might manage those kinds of scenarios where there is the potential for conflict, because we weren't necessarily agreeing about doing this. We were kind of going along with the journey of it.
Yeah.
And right at the end, there was the question about, well, Sonia, what are you doing here in this scenario? Because my role seemed to be very difficult to kind of pin down, because I'm not visible in the work. I didn't compose the piece.
You're the facilitator. You create the framework.
I've created the framework, but for some people, how is creating the framework an art practice? And so my role within it became very diffuse. It's like, well, where is she and why is and what is this talk and how might this? I mean, one of the questions I had, I remember giving a talk in the US, and bless them, but one member of audience stood up and said, so how is this black? Because it's an early kind of Renaissance music, and it's seemingly quite harsh modernist sound. How is this black? And so this was for me this was really interesting, because I couldn't be seen. I was not, in the way that we're looking at Ira Aldridge here, very visibly back within the piece, but I can't be seen in the piece.
Except you are the creator of the piece.
I'm the creator of the piece.
So how do you respond to that?
Well, I then started to talk about, and I suppose this is where the continuation with Exquisite Cacophony has kind of got me to so far, is that within an African American tradition of making nonsense and jazz scat and non-linguistic sound, and the question of the performative and the improvisational jag, if you listen to the sound, you can actually hear the influence of a kind of a black subjectivity somewhere in the sound, not necessarily in the visuality of the work.
Yeah.
So it operates in a non-visual way.
And it's interesting because the notion of identity and identity politics that's underpinned so much of your work is a complicated and nuanced thing, but it's interesting that response, for many people it's still contested, and if it's not explicit, it's not doing its job.
Yeah.
Do you find, it's clear that the battle, if that's what it was, hasn't been won, but do you think there are spaces now in British art and international art for nuanced identity political work, or do you still find that you have to fight a fairly harsh battle on occasion?
I think it's become much more complicated. I was part of that generation who were, and not only within the field of a kind of black art movement, but in a wider kind of critical framework, you could say, where there was this question about positive images and negative images. And this is one of the reasons why I've been, particularly in recent times, talking about what is the non-binary space, because the non-binary space actually has to deal with it's not one or the other, but it's one and the other, or it's that grey space where it's difficult. It may be also pleasurable. It may be just really complicated to unpick. And I think that the questions around representation from the 80s, which was looking for those hard and fast rules of yes, do that or don't do that, have shifted. I'm just part of that shift.
It's interesting because the exhibition at the end of the 80s, The Other Story, curated by Rashid Areen, where you and Eddie Chambers, Keith Piper, Manhati, many artists who've gone on to have international reputations, that was clearly the beginning of something, but it's often positioned as a summary and the end of something.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Ira, and let's go forward to you have a mid-career retrospective here at Manchester Art Gallery, and you've made a series of new works, but one called 6 Acts, that, I mean, almost literally starts with this work, and you have and you're working with a number of artists, but Lasana Shabazz assumes a kind of identity from Ira.
Yeah, what happened, and this project has been kind of rumbling for a few months, coming out of conversations with the gallery team here about part of their programme of what they call the takeover, gallery takeover. And I wasn't aware actually until we were walking around these permanent kind of 18th and 19th century galleries, historical galleries, that this particular painting was here. Yeah. And actually this painting really kick-started a whole range of thinking and relationships. And so what I wanted to do was to invite Lasana Shabazz, as you say, who's a performance artist, and I've known Lasana for all of his life, basically, but I'd never actually seen him perform. I know that he's been doing a whole series of performances called How to Be a Man. So I was thinking, well, actually, it would be really interesting to know how he would respond to this painting of Othello, given that his own thinking is about that masculinity itself is a performance. I then was also thinking, because of course I'd been living here in Manchester during my residency in the 90s, and was very aware that Canal Street is just around the corner, and that there is a very, there's a fabulous of gay and drag scene. Yeah. I'm thinking, out of the conversations that have been evolving, that actually there's a lot of questions about gender, about race, about sexuality and sensuality that are all kind of crisscrossing quite problematically. So, inviting all of these performers to come and do what they want, to just see things that they find interesting, and let's go off from there. Now, in the process of all of this, kind of realizing, okay, so you've got this painting, which is the first painting to have established the museum, and thinking, oh, that's a really interesting connection. Then, of course, I've been doing another project, a long-standing project called the Devotional Series, which is about creating a kind of collective memory of Black British female women in music. And the first name on that roll call is Amanda Aldridge, who's the daughter of Ira Aldridge. So kind of starting to think, oh, there's these really interesting connections going on. And then, of course, there's Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is one of the people who's often associated with the development of drag. So the drag scene often referred to Shakespeare, and apparently drag means dressed resembling a girl. But also, I think it's kind of quite contested how this term actually emerged, but the whole thing about a lot of Shakespeare's characters would be boys dressed as girls, or there'd be these kind of gender transformations going on within knowing about his plays. So kind of thinking that actually there's quite something really interesting about how underlying from this painting there are all these various things that are interrelated but also dispersed. So this was why I was starting to bring other people in to kind of think, okay, how might you perform in this gallery space? I'm sure at some point we're going to talk about Hylas.
I was just about to move on to that. But we've set up the fact that so there are 5 artists who are able to respond to and perform, and you're collecting material. Mm-hmm. And we know that the finished piece that you're going to show here in a couple of weeks' time is called 6 Acts, and it's a 6-screen work. So within that framework of setting in motion after a collaboration with these artists and with the gallery team here, mm-hmm. you also have an act up and take down mm-hmm. idea, mm-hmm. which is the removal of a painting, mm-hmm. Hylas and the Nymphs by Waterhouse, for a limited period of time with questions asked and public responses solicited. And then there was a sort of media shitstorm, mm-hmm. Which I suppose in a way would have been intriguing to you, but were you surprised by that?
Absolutely surprised. Absolutely surprised. I suppose because this was one of the 6 acts that had taken place. And I suppose what I haven't said is that, you know, the Gorgeous family, who are a drag family that came and made works, made performances in relation often to the paintings in this space, that this takedown of a painting was not the only thing that had happened. That there were many things happening in different spaces that particular night. And that how that painting how the decision had come about was part of a very long process of conversations that grew and grew and grew quite spontaneously with gallery staff, and then involved the performers that were invited, and then involved inviting visitors to the takedown, so that it was actually a growing and spontaneous thing.
And a performative thing.
And very much a performative thing. And really, I mean, for myself, the thing that I found very interesting, personally, I wasn't one of the people who took the painting down. It was taken down by very, very carefully taken down by the museum technicians here. But I was really interested in how this painting was opposite another painting of Sappho, and that there was a kind of queer narrative in both of these paintings, but both of these characters that were kind of named in the painting, somehow the moral end to them was that they would somehow, they'd have to die. And so for me, there was all these other kinds of questions going on across the many 6 acts that were taking place.
It was really interesting because, and also the notion of re-exploring the canon of art history, the fact that the hang here in the Manchester Art Galleries had been pretty well unchanged since 2002, and galleries constantly rehang. All of this was part of that. And I remember first reading the response, and it wasn't contextualised, it was played out in the context of censoriousness, that this work had been taken down because there was a moral view taken within the museum and that the work was taken down. Now, of course, there were moral aspects to people's conversation and responses, but it was very interesting that wasn't how it was framed. And it wasn't just in sort of the right-wing sectors of the media, it was across the board. Just for the record, is there an element of censorship that you're interested in exploring in this, or was that just a total misrepresentation? In other words, when we look back at art historical canon and re-explore it, is it about new perspectives, is it about challenging what's there, or is it sometimes, are you arguing, that we need to remove certain images in order to have those conversations more clearly? For me, I have to go back to my role as a kind of facilitator of almost taking the temperature of the room and taking the temperature of the conversation that had evolved over a particular length of time. Now, for me, my question was, what is it that people want to do? And what I have to announce is that in these things that I set up, I tell people to do whatever they want to do in those situations. I am an anti-director. I'm not telling people what to do. I'm saying, what do you want to do? And this is, of course, none of this has come into the nature of the conversation. So you're giving freedom rather than restricting.
Yeah, I'm saying, okay, what do you want to do within, this is the frame, what do you want to do within it? And allow that to happen. It gets recorded, and then I work with that material. But it's very important that I state that I am an anti-director in these scenarios, that I'm actually saying to people, what do you want to do? And what is possible within this? And as my own limits would be, as long as you don't hurt somebody. Nothing was harmed by the takedown of that painting.
Well, it's back up.
But in the takedown, and people will see when they see the work, that it was very carefully taken down. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about, in this whole process, is back, I think it was 1913, there was 3 suffragettes who came into Manchester Art Gallery with a hammer, and they broke several works. And this was a suffragette action. And so I was very aware, and this is something that the museum itself knows, and there are many events that kind of...
happened in the National Gallery with the Velasquez as well, of course.
Nothing was damaged on this particular night. Everybody was very careful to make sure that there was the chance to do what one wanted, but also that no one and nothing would get damaged. Because who would I be to damage another artist's work? That would be crazy. But the strength of feeling about what had come out of those discussions was, let's take it down and put up some questions. And get people involved in the questions. No work was damaged. No one was damaged.
I think you've explained it very, very well, very clearly, and you've now made me feel very conscious that I'm being over-directorial because I'm asking all the questions and we're running out of time. So it is my job, but I'd like to give the floor a brief chance. Are there questions that people would like to ask? We've got one or two already online, but gentleman at the back.
Yeah, I was here on the night of the exhibition when the painting was taken down, and I was the person who went to the Guardian 3 days later and brought the attention outside the gallery to a world audience. So when I had the interview on the phone with the guy from the Guardian, within 2 hours he'd put it through Guardian opinion, then it went everywhere. So what we were finding, it was a public interest situation because it's a public collection work, and because you're getting the general public feedback on this and the media focused on the Me Too campaigns, it looks like the thing was overstepping into new territories. So not just about human rights, but into creative expression in the arts. Yeah. So this kind of caused an offence or an affront to the public's view of what their collections are and what their work is that they, appreciate here. And so there's a kind of conflict between human interests and representation of people's interests, like the suffragettes and image. And then you've got historical collective works that have been here for many years. So, for instance, when you say it's political, in America you have these statues of Confederate achievements, and then people wanted to, knock them down and get them out of public display.
This is brilliant. Have you got a question?
So the question is, well, my point is to you is how, because I know you've done work in America as well, is the image of the black person in America is how we've kind of to blend in, to be accepted, to remove slavery and become part of society, in white American society. This has obviously been going on, over 100 years or so. And the same thing with women's rights, where women have had to, now to get equality, to pick up the beer glass and put their feet on the table. So my point is is it the right way? Because you said there's conflicts of interest between identity, fitting in, and being yourself and expressing yourself. And what is that conflict that you see of being yourself or just blending into white society and sort of to gain acceptance, you've got to kind of fit in, because women have to do the same things to fit in to get more equal rights with males here, and the same things with homosexuality. Right, people have to put on dresses.
To Sonia, thank you. That's really good. I think it's a very interesting point about how much conflict do we need in order to make these points powerfully. Because you have used conflict, haven't you, in your work?
Yes, and I'm interested in the ways in which I do have to say that I don't see myself as a representative figure in the way that it's kind of being framed here, in that I'm not here to speak on behalf of all black women, or gays, or black people, or all white people. I'm not positioning myself as a representative figure. One, because I think there are too many differences in those particular groupings that basically lead us to a form of essentialism. And for me, that essentialism leads us down a road of racism or sexism or all of those things. So I'm not saying that I'm here as a representative of anybody. Let's put that to the side. I am interested in the ways in which how difference gets negotiated. And for me, a lot of the work that I've been doing is about, or I see it to be about, the question of entanglement. Not fitting in or not fitting in, but the entanglement and what comes out of those entanglements and what comes out of those entangled histories. And those entangled histories are good and bad and somewhere in between. So I'm not trying to fit into white society, because I don't believe there's such a thing as white society. I think there is society, and I think there are many people and many entangled histories that make up that society. I don't know if that makes that clear.
It does, actually. And very interesting to hear an artist say, I'm not interested in I don't want to disentangle. I want to look at the entanglement and actually ruminate on where that takes us.
The other thing is that, and I've been having this conversation for the last couple of days, I do see my practice as research. And when I say research, I mean, what if I do this and do that, what happens? Now that can lead to something going desperately wrong, fantastically right, both at the same time. The worst thing it can be is uninteresting for me. It's like if it becomes uninteresting, it becomes a dead end. Okay, let's park that. I'm interested in the unfolding of things and what happens, and then trying to make sense of it. So this question about being right or being wrong doesn't fit. It's what happens. What can happen if you've got people in a room? We all know how to be in a room, I'm assuming. We've all been in a room before. We know what happens in that room. Let's see what can happen. We record it. Let's see what can be made of it. But I'm not interested in the right answer or the wrong answer, or saying to people, I'm really not interested in coercing anybody. I'm absolutely not interested in coercing anybody. I'll give you my opinion, but I'm not expecting you to sign up to my opinion. You can have your own opinion, as far as I'm concerned.
I've got a question from Facebook that's just come in, which says, it takes us back to Ira. As this painting was Manchester Art Gallery's first acquisition, hanging it would have made an impact on the gallery space by presenting new perspectives. Would you say this is an inspiration in your work of reinterpreting curatorial spaces? That's from Beatrice Pinaranda. How do you respond to that? Are you interested in more and more curatorially reinterpreting spaces?
Absolutely. Because the past does not sit still. However much we would want it to, it just doesn't, because we're always thinking about it from the perspective of where we are.
And how does context work for you? I mean, I was thinking about the various pieces we've discussed of yours. You made one at the V&A, Exquisite Cacophony, then it was shown in the Venice Biennale. You're now going to show it in 2 weeks' time here in Manchester. Does your work fundamentally change for you as the context shift?
Absolutely. The devotional wallpaper, it's again a grid. 200 names of Black British female musicians, and every time it's been shown, a name comes out, another name goes in. So as a print or as a wallpaper, it itself is constantly changing. It doesn't sit still. The past doesn't sit still. It just doesn't. So for me, the recontextualizing of work, particularly trying to figure out how a work fits into a new space, is very important.
It's great talking to you, Sonia, because there's a real clarity of expression, but I love this fluidity. And as always, you've left a lot of questions up in the air, which is great. So the debate can continue online. You can go to the Manchester Art Gallery website for the continuation of that debate. You can go to hashtag Objects of Obsession. But can I thank Manchester Art Gallery for allowing us to be here, but in particular, can I thank Sonia Boyce for doing this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you.